Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily, just for you.
It started with a dare. It wasn't their first late-night adventure. Ella, Lucas, Mark, and Chloe had explored the woods behind their small town plenty of times. But Halloween was different. There was something about the way the trees creaked, the way the wind carried whispers instead of gusts that made the woods seem alive. "You're full of it," Lucas said, stepping over a gnarled root. "There's no way these trees talk." Mark smirked, holding his flashlight under his chin like a campfire storyteller. "Oh, they talk. You just have to be quiet enough to hear them. The story goes, anyone who lingers after midnight will hear the forest speak their name. And if you answer, that's it. You're part of the woods forever." Chloe rolled her eyes. "Right. And next you'll tell us there's a cabin out here with a witch inside." "No cabin," Mark said. "Just voices. Some say they're people who got lost, people who answered." Ella shivered but forced a laugh. "What are we waiting for then? Let's see if the woods have something to say." They pushed deeper into the trees, their flashlights flickering over twisted trunks and tangled undergrowth. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. The usual night sounds, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, faded into an almost oppressive silence. Mark stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. "Listen." At first they heard nothing, but then faint and far off came a low whisper. It was like a breath against the back of the neck, soft, barely there, but impossible to ignore. Ella felt the hairs on her arms stand on end. "What is that?" "No way," Lucas muttered, scanning the darkness. "It's just the wind." The sound grew louder. Not the wind, not animals. It was unmistakable now. Voices. They drifted in from every direction, words blending together, overlapping. Some were clear fragments of sentences, pleas, questions, while others were no more than a hiss. The sound grew louder. Not the wind, not animals. It was unmistakable now. Voices. They drifted in from every direction, words blending together, overlapping. Some were clear fragments of sentences, pleas, questions. "Let's go," Chloe said, her voice shaky. "We've had our fun." "Wait," Mark said. "It's almost midnight. That's when the real whispers start." "No," Ella said, grabbing his arm. "We shouldn't." The clock on Lucas's phone struck 12. The whispers stopped. For one agonizing moment, everything was still. The woods held their breath. Then the voices came back, all at once, louder than before. This time, they weren't just whispers. They were calling out their names. Ella heard it first, her name spoken softly but insistently. Then Chloe's name, then Lucas's, then Mark's. Over and over, like a chant. "Time to run," Chloe said, already backing away. Ella turned, heart pounding, but the way back was swallowed by the shadows. The trees seemed closer now, the paths less clear. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Then, from somewhere ahead, a voice that didn't belong to any of them called out, clear and sharp, "Spay." Ella froze. The others did too. The forest fell silent again, but the chill in the air remained. The friends exchanged glances, fear etched on their faces. No one dared to speak. They turned and ran. The only sound, their labored breaths and the crunch of leaves underfoot. The trees didn't reach for them. The whispers didn't follow. But the memory stayed. Even after they reached the edge of the woods, even after the familiar lights of the town came into view, that one word echoed in Ella's mind. Stay, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered, what would have happened if they had? Ella hadn't been sleeping well. Ever since that night in the woods, her dreams had been strange, dark silhouettes chasing her, voices echoing in her ears. But the dreams weren't the worst of it. It was the knocking that truly terrified her. It started faintly, just a soft tap against her bedroom window. At first, she thought it was the wind, or maybe a stray branch, brushing the glass. But then it became more rhythmic, persistent. Every night, without fail, just after midnight, the knocking would return. She didn't tell her parents. What could she say? That something was knocking on her second-story window? They'd just say she was imagining things. That it was some overactive Halloween jitters. So she kept quiet, waiting for the sounds to stop on their own. They didn't. One particularly cold night, when her room was lit only by the pale glow of her nightlight, the knocks came louder than ever. 3 sharp taps, then silence. 3 more. Ella sat up in bed, clutching the blankets to her chest, her heart racing. It's just the wind, she told herself. Just the wind. But something inside her urged her to look. Slowly, she swung her legs over the edge of the bed and tiptoed to the window. Her breath fogged the glass as she pressed her face closer, squinting into the darkness outside. The trees swayed faintly, casting long, eerie shadows. Everything seemed still. Then she saw it. A figure standing just beyond the light of the street lamp, its shape barely discernible against the darkened houses across the street. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its arms dangling at its sides. The shadow of it shouldn't have been visible from where it stood, but somehow it was. Ella stumbled back, tripping over her blanket and landing hard on the floor. She scrambled back to her bed, heart pounding in her chest. "Mom! Dad!" she called out, but her voice cracked. The house was quiet. Everyone else was asleep. Another knock, this time louder, more insistent. Ella froze, too terrified to look again. She sat in the corner of her bed, clutching her knees, staring at the window, but unable to bring herself to move closer. She stared until the first rays of morning light crept through the curtains. By the time her parents woke and came to check on her, the figure was gone. There was no sign of anything unusual outside. The street was quiet, empty. Even the knocking had stopped. But Ella knew what she'd seen. She knew it wasn't a dream. The knocking didn't return for the next few nights. Ella almost began to believe it was all in her head. Almost. But when she finally felt comfortable enough to sleep again, the sound came back, louder than ever. And this time, she swore she heard her name. Mark had been restless since that night in the woods. While Ella and Chloe were skittish and Lucas refused to talk about it, Mark couldn't let it go. He needed to know what they had experienced. It was just some wind, some trick of the mind. It had to be. So he went back alone. He waited until a Saturday afternoon, when he could head into the whispering woods without drawing too much attention. The sunlight wasn't as comforting as he thought it would be. The deeper he ventured, the more the trees seemed to close in, casting long shadows that writhed with the wind. But he pressed on, scanning the ground for signs of the clearing they had stumbled upon that Halloween night. It took hours before he found anything unusual. Mark paused when he noticed an unnatural break in the pattern of the forest floor, patches of grass matted down, as if something heavy had been dragged across them. His heart beat a little faster, but he convinced himself it was just an old trail left by a deer or a passing hunter. Then he spotted the well. At first, he thought it was just a mound of rocks covered in moss. But as he stepped closer, he realized it was circular. The stones, rough and weathered, the opening partially collapsed in on itself. It was so old, the surrounding forest had grown up around it, as if trying to hide it. Mark crouched down, peering into the darkness. He couldn't see the bottom, not even with the sunlight filtering through the canopy. A faint smell wafted up, earthy, damp, and something else, something faintly metallic. He reached for his flashlight, which had been clipped to his belt. "Just a well," he muttered aloud, though hearing his own voice out here felt strange, too loud. No big deal. As the beam of his flashlight cut into the well's depths, he squinted, looking for water or debris. But there was nothing, just blackness that seemed to stretch too far, like it wasn't really a well at all. Then he saw movement. It was subtle, like a flicker at the edge of his vision. Mark leaned closer, tilting the flashlight to get a better angle. His pulse quickened when the darkness at the bottom shifted again, this time slower, more deliberate. Something was down there. He knew he should turn around, walk away, leave the woods behind, and never return. But he didn't. Mark edged a little closer, his breath coming out in short, shallow bursts. His curiosity overwhelmed his fear. "Hey," he called down, his voice trembling. "Is someone down there?" The silence was so complete, it made his ears ring, and then, as if in response, a faint sound came. At first, he couldn't tell what it was. Water dripping? A whisper? No, it was a scraping, slow, deliberate, like something dragging against the stone walls. The sound grew louder, closer, until he could almost feel it reverberating through the ground. A hand shot up out of the darkness. Mark screamed, dropping the flashlight. He stumbled backward, falling hard onto the ground. The flashlight rolled to the side, its beam illuminating the well's mouth. For a split second, he saw it. Gray, clawed fingers grasping the edge, pale as bone. And then, it was gone, retreating into the shadows below. Mark scrambled to his feet and ran. He didn't look back. The forest seemed alive around him, the trees creaking and whispering, the wind pushing him forward. By the time he burst into the open fields beyond the woods, his legs were trembling and he could hardly breathe. When he reached the safety of his house, he locked every door and window, double-checking each one twice. He never told his friends what he'd seen. He barely slept that night, or any night after. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again. That hand, those fingers, and that endless darkness waiting below. Chloe didn't like mirrors. Even as a kid, she'd avoided looking at them in the dark. It wasn't that she thought they were haunted or anything. It was just a gut feeling, an unease she could never quite shake. But after that night in the woods, it went from unease to dread. At first, it was subtle. When Chloe passed by her bathroom mirror, she noticed something odd in the corner of her eye. Her reflection moved, but it didn't quite match her movements. She thought she was imagining it, tricks of light, tired eyes, paranoia, so she ignored it. But the incidents kept piling up. One night, brushing her teeth, she glanced at her reflection, only to see herself blink when she hadn't. Another time, she leaned forward to rinse her face, and when she stood up, her reflection seemed a beat behind, catching up as if it had been distracted. "Chloe, you need more sleep," she muttered, trying to laugh it off. But her reflection didn't smile back. The turning point came late one evening. Chloe was scrolling through her phone on her bed, trying not to think about anything scary. Her bathroom door was ajar, the mirror just barely visible from where she sat. Something caught her eye, a flicker of movement. Probably the cat, she thought. Except her cat was asleep at her feet. She glanced over, heart thumping. The bathroom was dark, but the mirror reflected her room's faint glow. And in the reflection, Chloe swore she saw someone standing there. Someone who wasn't in her actual room. She froze, her fingers gripping her phone. Her pulse roared in her ears as she strained to make out the figure. But when she looked directly at the mirror, there was nothing. Just her own wide-eyed reflection. "It's nothing. I'm tired. I'm seeing things." The next morning, Chloe decided enough was enough. She avoided the mirror entirely while getting ready for school. But as she left her room, she turned back, almost as if compelled. The mirror stood there, innocent and still, yet her stomach churned with unease. When she got home that afternoon, Chloe tried to ignore the mirror, focusing on her homework and her friends' texts. But she couldn't escape the feeling that something was off. That night, when the house was quiet and dark, she finally gave in to the impulse. She stood in front of the mirror, her face pale in the dim light. "This is stupid," she whispered. "It's just a mirror. There's nothing there." Her reflection whispered something back. Chloe recoiled, her breath hitching. The voice hadn't come from her own lips. It was faint, but unmistakable. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was pleading. Desperate. "Who's there?" she stammered, her voice shaking. Her reflection didn't answer. It just stared at her. Its eyes seemed darker than they should be, the shadows around its face deeper. The corner of its mouth curled, not into a smile, but something close. Chloe backed away. nearly tripping over her own feet. She slammed the bathroom door shut, her heart hammering. She didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she thought she heard the faint murmur of her own voice, calling her name from somewhere just out of reach. And in her mind, she saw her reflection's mouth moving silently, forming words she couldn't hear, but that she felt certain she never wanted to understand. It began with a sound, a faint scratching, just before sunrise, so subtle that Lucas thought it might be a mouse in the walls. But when he checked, there was no sign of any pests. The scratching grew louder as the days passed, like nails dragging over wood. Every time he pressed his ear to the wall, it stopped. Lucas didn't want to admit he was scared. He'd always been the skeptic, the one to call out Mark for his wild stories and to laugh when Chloe mentioned her mirror trouble. But now, he was hearing things he couldn't explain. One night, the scratching turned into tapping. It was coming from the attic. At first, Lucas thought he'd imagined it. But as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the tapping continued. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Over and over, in a pattern too deliberate to be a coincidence. He told himself it was just the old house settling, nothing more. He pulled the covers over his head and waited for it to stop. But the next night, it was back. This time, louder. Eventually, he couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight, Lucas crept into the attic. Dust particles danced in the beam of light as he climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking under his weight. He scanned the space. Old trunks, stacks of yellowing newspapers, cobwebbed beams. Nothing that could explain the sounds. Then he noticed the door. It was small and tucked into the far corner of the attic, a weathered wooden panel that didn't match the rest of the house. Lucas had never seen it before. He was sure of it. They'd moved into this house years ago, and he'd explored the attic countless times. There was no door here. Its flashlight wavered as his hands started to shake. The door had no knob, just a faint indentation, as though someone had forced it shut long ago. As Lucas moved closer, the air grew colder. The knocking came again, this time from inside the door. 3 deliberate knocks, and then silence. "Hello?" he called out, his voice hoarse. No answer. He placed his hand on the door's surface, and it felt damp, almost slick, like something alive. He jerked his hand back. The knocking started again, faster now, almost frantic. Lucas stumbled back and bolted down the attic stairs. When he told his parents about the door the next morning, they exchanged uneasy looks. His dad laughed it off, saying it was probably just his imagination. But his mom didn't laugh. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Don't go near it again." That night, the knocking grew louder, relentless. Lucas tried to ignore it, but it was impossible to sleep. He couldn't help but wonder what was behind that door, and why his parents had seemed so unwilling to talk about it. Over the next few days, the knocks turned into muffled voices. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, almost mournful. By the end of the week, it sounded like someone was dragging their fingers along the walls inside his room, the noise moving closer and closer to his bed. Lucas woke one night to the sensation of pressure on his chest. He opened his eyes and saw the faint outline of a figure above him, blurry in the darkness. It leaned down, close to his ear, and whispered his name. He screamed. The figure vanished. His parents rushed into his room, but there was nothing to see. The attic door was gone the next day. Lucas went back up to check, determined to prove he hadn't imagined it. But when he reached the corner where it had been, there was only a blank wall. His parents acted like the door had never been there, like he'd made it all up. But every night, he could still hear the faintest tap, 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 followed by his name whispered from just beyond the walls. Ella found it on her doorstep one chilly November morning, just as the frost was beginning to melt in the weak sunlight. A small leather-bound book, aged and scuffed as though it had been carried through many years and many hands. She had no idea who left it there. There was no note, no indication of its origin, just the diary, sitting innocuously on the top step. She flipped through the pages as she sat on the couch, the faint smell of mildew wafting from the yellowed paper. At first, the entries seemed mundane. Lists of chores, snippets of poetry, vague musings about the weather. But as she read further, Ella froze. A writing shifted. It was still in the same delicate looping script, but the words started to feel uncomfortably familiar. The diary began describing things she had done, places she had visited, conversations she'd had. It was as though someone had been shadowing her, cataloging her every move.
October 31st. Ella went with her friends into the woods again.
They didn't stay long this time, but the forest was alive, watching. Midnight came, and the air whispered their names. Ella heard it first, and she didn't answer. Her stomach churned. That was exactly what had happened that night, down to the way she'd heard her name first. How could someone have written it in this diary long before it had even happened? Ella slammed the book shut and shoved it into her bag. She told herself it had to be a joke. Maybe one of her friends was messing with her, or maybe it was some strange coincidence. She decided to ignore it, to leave the diary untouched, but she couldn't. That night, Ella dreamt of the woods. The whispers came again, louder this time, wrapping around her like vines. When she woke, her bag was on the floor. The diary opened and flipped to a page she hadn't read before. November 5th. Ella decides to ignore me, but I know her better than she knows herself. Tomorrow, she'll read this page and understand. There's no escape from what's coming. Not for her, not for any of them. Her breath caught in her throat. The date, November 5th, was today. Tell me this isn't real, she whispered to no one, the room too quiet around her. She slammed the book shut again, heart pounding. It felt as if the walls themselves were listening. Ella spent the entire day trying to forget the diary. She shoved it into a drawer, went out with her friends, watched movies, tried to drown the gnawing unease with laughter. But the laughter felt hollow, and when she got home that evening, the diary wasn't in her drawer. It was back on the nightstand, waiting for her. Her hands shook as she opened it. The pages now felt cold, like they'd been sitting in a freezer. Her fingers skimmed the new entry, each word unraveling her nerves. November 5th. Ella is scared now, but she can't stop reading. By tomorrow, she'll know who left this for her. She'll understand who I am. But it will be too late. The others will hear from me soon, too. Tell her not to turn the next page if she wants to be safe. Her throat went dry. Her eyes lingered on the bottom of the page. Her pulse a thunderous rhythm in her ears. She shouldn't turn the page, but she had to. The moment she did, the room went cold. The words were scrawled in jagged handwriting, as if the author had been trembling. Run. A letter seemed to glow faintly, as though the ink was still wet. Ella slammed the diary shut for the final time and stuffed it in the back of her closet. She didn't sleep that night. But by morning, the diary had returned to her nightstand again, its leather cover now cracked open slightly, as if beckoning her to look. And she swore she heard faint whispering from its pages, whispering that carried her name. Mark had always felt grounded in the ordinary, the explainable. When the strange things started happening after Halloween night, he chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe a string of bad luck. The woods? Just creepy folklore. The noises and fleeting glimpses the others complained about. Their imaginations running wild. But then his shadows began to misbehave. It started one morning as he walked to school. The sun was still low, casting long, sharp shadows across the sidewalk. Mark noticed that his shadow looked off. It didn't move quite right. When he turned his head, his shadow's head hesitated before following. When he raised his arm to wave to a classmate, his shadow's arm lifted a moment too late, as if lagging behind him. He tried shaking it off, blaming his tired eyes or the angle of the sun. By the afternoon, it was harder to ignore. In the bright light of the cafeteria, where he sat with his friends, he glanced down and saw his shadow stretching out far longer than it should have. While everyone else's shadows lay neatly beneath their chairs, Mark's elongated across the floor, reaching for the far wall. He blinked and looked again. This time, it was normal. His friends didn't seem to notice. At home, the shadows became bolder.
As he played video games in his room,
The single lamp on his desk cast his silhouette on the wall. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw it move, but not with him.
Mark froze, gripping his controller. His shadow's head tilted, its shoulders tensing,
Even though he was completely still.
When he turned toward it, it immediately snapped back into place,
Perfectly mirroring his position.
his heart began to race.
He turned the light off and sat in the dark, hoping that no light meant no shadows. But the sensation of being watched didn't fade. Days passed, and Mark's shadows grew more distinct from him.
He'd catch them turning corners just before he did,
Stretching long and thin when he stood still, or appearing behind him when he knew the light source was in front.
He started avoiding well-lit places altogether,
Retreating to dim rooms and drawing the blinds shut. But it didn't matter.
the shadows followed him,
Sometimes even seeming to appear without any source of light.
One night, as Mark lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the moonlight filtering through the curtains cast a faint silhouette of him on the wall.
He wasn't moving, yet the shadow raised a hand, fingers curling one by one, as if beckoning. Mark sat up abruptly, the shadow lowering its hand the moment he moved.
He couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet, too still.
Around 3 a.m. he gave up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed and sitting in the dark. The room seemed darker than usual, the shadows pooling unnaturally in the corners. That's when he saw it. Not his shadow, but another, longer, taller, and far too slender to be his. It lingered at the edge of his vision, wavering like smoke. As he watched, it slowly began to move closer, creeping along the floor, the walls, the ceiling. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He fumbled for his phone, trying to switch on its flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but his familiar room. The shadow was gone.
But as he exhaled in relief,
Something shifted in the glow of his phone screen. His own shadow, projected against the wall, turned its head toward him. It wasn't him. It was never him. And this time it smiled.
Mark dropped the phone and scrambled backward, his heart hammering.
The shadow didn't move with him. It stood there, grinning faintly. Even as the light faded, the smile widened as the room plunged into darkness.
Mark didn't sleep that night or the next.
And no matter how much he avoided the light, he couldn't escape the shadows. They didn't just follow him. They were waiting, watching, growing bolder. Chloe had always loved old family photos. Her grandmother had left behind stacks of them, stored in brittle albums with yellowed pages and the faint smell of mildew. But one in particular caught her attention after that fateful Halloween. An old photograph she found in a cracked wooden frame, tucked away in the attic.
It was a group portrait of her family,
Taken decades before she was born. Everyone in the picture wore stiff formal clothing, their faces stoic except for the faintest trace of a smile on her great-grandmother's lips. Chloe liked the picture. There was something peaceful about it, until the first crack appeared.
It started small, a thin line creeping across the corner of the glass.
Chloe assumed she'd bumped it when taking the frame down from the attic. But the next day, a second crack appeared, then a third. Soon the entire surface of the glass was crisscrossed with jagged lines. The more Chloe examined it, the more the cracks seemed to form a pattern like spider webs.
She set the photograph on her nightstand,
intending to replace the frame later. As the days went on, the photo began to change.
It was subtle at first. Her great-grandmother's faint smile grew more pronounced.
Her great-uncle's eyes seemed darker, almost sunken.
The faces that had once looked serene now seemed off. Off.
Chloe convinced herself she was imagining it. Photos couldn't change after all.
Then one night, as she turned off her lamp and climbed into bed,
She glanced at the photo. Her great-grandmother's smile had become a wide, toothy grin. Her eyes, once gentle, were now narrowed into sharp, gleaming slits. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed her phone and snapped a picture of the photo to compare it to an older version online.
her phone screen showed the image as it had always been.
Stoic, somber faces, no grins, no changes,
Chloe stared back at the physical photograph. It was the same as before, wide smiles, hollow eyes. Her hands trembled as she set it face down on the nightstand. The following morning, she found the photograph upright again. The cracks in the glass had deepened, forming a jagged spiral that seemed to center on her great-grandmother's eyes. Chloe's own image, which she hadn't noticed before, was faintly visible in the background reflection. It wasn't there when she checked the photo online. It had never been there before. As days passed, her reflection grew clearer. It wasn't just a faint outline anymore. It was her, perfectly her, standing just behind her great-grandmother's chair. And as her reflection grew sharper, the faces of her relatives grew stranger. Their grins widened impossibly, their eyes vanishing into black voids. Chloe tried to get rid of the photograph. She buried it in a box in the garage, but it always found its way back to her nightstand by morning. She considered breaking the glass, burning it, anything to get rid of the unnerving image, but something stopped her. Every time she held the frame in her hands, an icy dread paralyzed her. One night she awoke to the sound of cracking glass. The photo sat on her nightstand, the light of the moon catching the deep fractures. The glass seemed to ripple, as though something was moving underneath it. Chloe watched in frozen terror as her reflection, clearer than ever, tilted its head. Then it smiled. The cracks spread all at once, splintering with a loud snap that made her jump. For a moment, the photograph looked like it would shatter entirely. Then the glass fell still. Her reflection no longer smiled. It stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes. The next morning, Chloe found herself in the background of every photograph in her house. It didn't matter how old the picture was or where it had been taken. There she was, sometimes faint, sometimes as clear as day, always standing behind the smiling figures, always looking directly at the camera. When she returned to the attic to put the original photo back, it was gone. In its place, she found a blank piece of cracked glass. Lucas's younger brother Ben had always been a quiet kid. He didn't have many friends at school, preferring to stay home and read or play with his action figures. When he found the puppet in the basement, Lucas thought it was just another phase, something new to keep him occupied. But the puppet quickly became more than that. It was ugly, for starters. Its face was carved wood, chipped and flaking, with sunken eyes painted a dull, lifeless black. Its mouth was a jagged slit, the edges splintered, and its arms and legs hung limp, covered in faded, moth-eaten fabric. Ben named it Charlie and carried it everywhere. At first, Lucas thought it was just weird. Kids latched on to strange toys all the time, right? But it wasn't long before Charlie started to creep him out. Lucas noticed Ben talking to the puppet. That wasn't unusual. Lots of kids had imaginary conversations with their toys. But Ben's whispers weren't playful or silly. They were soft, urgent, like he was asking Charlie questions and listening intently to the answers. And then there were the pauses. Lucas would stand in the hallway outside Ben's room, hearing his brother murmur something, then fall silent as if waiting for a response. The gaps were too long. They felt wrong. "Hey Ben," Lucas asked one day. "What's with Charlie? You've been talking to him a lot." Then turned to him, clutching the puppet to his chest. "He likes to talk at night. He tells me stories." Lucas frowned. What kind of stories? Ben's eyes seemed to glaze over. Stories about before he got here, about the other kids he knew. His voice was flat, almost detached. Lucas felt the chill crawl up his spine. "That's..." Lucas hesitated, trying not to sound freaked out. "That's kind of weird, Ben. Maybe you should leave him downstairs." Anne hugged Charlie tighter. "He doesn't like the basement. He says it's cold." Lucas didn't press further. He couldn't explain why, but something about the way Ben said it, like the puppet had told him directly, left Lucas feeling uneasy. The noises started that night. Faint tapping from Ben's room, like something hard was knocking against the floor. Lucas checked in on him, but Ben was fast asleep, Charlie tucked under one arm. Lucas could have sworn the puppet's head was turned slightly, its painted eyes glinting in the dim light. Then came the whispers. Lucas would hear them late at night, long after Ben had gone to bed. He wasn't sure if they were coming from Ben's room or the hallway, but they were soft, hushed tones, too low to make out. Once, when he crept to the door to listen, he could have sworn he heard Ben's voice. Then a second voice, one that was thinner, raspier, like dry wood creaking. He backed away and shut his own door,
pretending he hadn't heard a thing.
Things got worse as the days passed. Lucas began waking up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone was watching him. His door would be slightly ajar, even though he'd closed it. And once, when he looked toward the crack, he thought he saw the edge of Charlie's wooden face peering through. He jumped out of bed and yanked the door open, but there was nothing there, just shadows. One evening, when Lucas had finally had enough, he marched into Ben's room. "Look, Ben, this puppet thing is getting out of hand. It's not normal." Ben was sitting on his bed, cradling Charlie.
He looked up at Lucas with wide eyes.
"I can't get rid of him," he said. "He says he'll get mad if I try." Lucas tried to grab the puppet, but Ben yanked it away, clutching it to his chest. For a brief moment, Lucas thought he saw Charlie's lips part. Just a fraction, like they were about to move. He froze and looked at him, his voice a strange mix of sadness and fear. "He says you belong to him now." Lucas stared at the puppet's lifeless face, the painted black eyes that seemed deeper than they should have been. He backed away slowly, leaving the room. That night, he locked his bedroom door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. But as he lay in bed, he heard the faint creak of floorboards in the hallway.
Then the soft rasping whisper of wood against wood, closer than ever.
And this time, the voice wasn't just in Ben's room,
it was right outside his door.
Ella first saw her double on her walk home from school. It was just a glimpse, a girl wearing the same school uniform, standing across the street. Her hair was the same length and color as Ella's, falling over her face in a way that made it hard to see her expression. At first, Ella thought it might be her imagination. But as she stared, the girl lifted her head, and Ella felt her stomach drop. It was her, the same freckle pattern on her nose, the same slight tilt to her head. It was like looking in a mirror, except the girl across the street wasn't holding a bag or walking home. She was just standing there, staring. Ella turned away for a moment, hoping that when she looked back, the girl would be gone. But when she glanced over, her double had turned and walked away. Ella couldn't explain the heavy weight that settled in her chest. It was just some random girl, right? Someone who happened to look a lot like her. That's all it was. The next time she saw her double, it was in the park. Ella was sitting on a bench, reading, when she felt that prickling sensation like someone was watching her. She looked up, and there she was, the same girl, standing just a few yards away, half hidden behind a tree. This time, Ella called out, "Hey, who are you?" The girl didn't respond. She stepped out from behind the tree, the dappled sunlight playing off her face. Ella's stomach twisted. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was her. The same pale scar on her chin from when she fell off her bike as a kid. The same faded bracelet on her wrist. Ella stood, heart pounding, but the girl turned and walked into the woods before Ella could approach her. Ella's friends tried to reassure her. "It's probably someone messing with you," Chloe suggested. "Like a prank." "Yeah," Mark agreed, though he looked uneasy.
"There's no way it's actually you."
But Ella wasn't convinced. It felt too deliberate. Each time her double appeared, she seemed closer, more aware of Ella's presence. It wasn't just chance. Ella stopped going certain places, avoided walking home alone, but it didn't help. Her double always found her. One evening, as Ella sat at her desk trying to focus on homework, she caught movement in the reflection of her laptop screen. She turned quickly and saw nothing. Her bedroom was empty, but the reflection still showed her double standing in the doorway. Ella whipped her head back and forth, searching, but no one was there. The reflection, however, didn't disappear. Her double stared at her, unsmiling, before turning and walking out of view. The reflection returned to normal. The doorway was empty. Ella felt her hands tremble as she shut her laptop. That night she didn't sleep. She kept the lights on, her eyes fixed on the corners of her room, waiting for her double to appear again. But the room stayed still, silent. It was worse the next day. Ella saw her double again, this time in a crowd, walking right toward her. For a moment, they locked eyes,
The double's gaze was dark, intense, filled with something Ella couldn't name but instinctively feared. Then, without a word, she melted into the sea of people.
Ella's friends stopped doubting her. They hadn't seen the double, but they could see what it was doing to Ella. She was jumpy, constantly glancing over her shoulder, her skin pale and her hands shaking whenever the subject came up. She didn't know what to do anymore. She couldn't shake the feeling that her double wasn't just watching her, wasn't just a reflection. It wanted something, and it was getting closer every time she saw it. Mark's plan was simple. Leave town, get out of Dodge, head to the next city over, and forget everything about the woods, the voices, and the strange shadows that had started haunting his every move. He figured if he got far enough away, the nightmares would stop. He'd tried everything else, ignoring it, pretending it wasn't real, telling himself it was all just stress, but none of it had worked. So one crisp November afternoon, Mark packed a bag, got in his old hatchback, and started driving. The route was straightforward. Head north for a few miles, take the highway west, and keep going until he hit city lights. It should have been easy. The first time it happened, he barely noticed. Mark turned onto a narrow road that would connect him to the highway. The trees on either side loomed higher than he remembered, their branches reaching overhead like skeletal hands. The sunlight filtered through in odd patterns, creating shifting patches of light and shadow on the pavement. It gave him the creeps, sure, but it was a back road, nothing unusual there. But when he looked down at his phone's map, it showed that he hadn't moved. The blinking dot marking his position remained stuck, as if he hadn't traveled any distance at all. Stupid app, he muttered, shaking his head. He restarted the phone, waited for it to reload, and tried again. This time the map updated, showing he'd progressed a little. Relieved, Mark kept driving. The second time, it was harder to ignore. The road began to look unfamiliar, twisting and turning in ways that didn't match his memory. He hadn't taken this road in years, sure, but how could it have changed so much? After a particularly sharp bend, he realized he wasn't heading west anymore. The sun, now sinking lower in the sky, was glaring through his windshield, dead ahead. He was driving straight back toward town. Mark pulled over, gripping the steering wheel tight. He stared at the dashboard clock. It was later than he thought. He must have turned around at some point without realizing. Annoyed, he spun the car around and started heading west again, this time watching his compass closely. He passed a weathered sign he recognized, the one that always made him think he was halfway out of the woods. At least he was back on track, but then he saw the sign again, and again. By the fourth time, panic started to creep in. The road stretched ahead endlessly, the scenery repeating like a looped video. Mark's foot pressed harder on the accelerator. He passed the same crooked tree, the same abandoned gas station, the same battered mile marker. He should have reached the highway by now. He should have been halfway to the city. Instead, he felt as though the forest itself was playing tricks on him. Every turn brought him back to the same stretch of road. Every straightaway led him to the same eerie landmarks. The trees seemed closer, their trunks leaning inward, their branches tangling together like a cage. The shadows shifted, no longer lining up with the setting sun. Mark stopped the car in the middle of the road and got out, his breath steaming in the cold air. He stood there, heart hammering, listening to the unsettling stillness of the woods. "I'll walk," he told himself. "I'll just follow the road on foot and find a way out." He took a few steps, and his shadow stretched unnaturally long ahead of him. Turning, he saw his car still parked, looking smaller somehow, as though it were farther away than it should have been. He glanced down at his phone. No service. The compass app refused to load. The map wouldn't update. Mark kept walking. The road grew narrower, the forest thicker. The light faded faster than it should have. Soon he was stumbling through twilight, his only guide the crumbling line of asphalt under his feet. He passed a bent road sign that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. And then, just ahead, he saw the faint outline of a dirt path branching off into the woods. He hesitated. It wasn't marked, and he'd never seen it before. But something about it called to him. The road behind him had led nowhere,
Maybe the path would take him somewhere new. Somewhere out.
Mark stepped onto the dirt trail. The forest swallowed him whole, and the road behind him vanished. Chloe was the first to admit that she'd been on edge lately. The strange photo, Ella's stories about her double, and Lucas's whispered tales about a locked door that shouldn't exist. It all piled up. She wasn't one to jump at shadows, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like the world had shifted just slightly out of place. It was the murmurs that finally broke her fragile sense of calm. They started late one night as she lay in bed scrolling through her phone. At first, it was so faint that she thought it was just the sound of the wind through the trees outside. But the longer she listened, the clearer it became. Low, muffled voices, whispering just at the edge of hearing. She sat up, straining to make out the words. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Her closet, the vents, the walls. She got up and checked the air vent above her desk, half expecting to find something trapped inside. Nothing. She opened her closet, flipped on the light, and saw only her clothes and a pile of shoes. Probably just my imagination, she muttered to herself, climbing back into bed. The next night, the whispers came again. This time they were slightly louder, though still impossible to understand. Chloe grabbed her phone and hit the record button, holding it up toward the vent. After a few minutes, the murmurs stopped, and she hit play. All she heard was static. No voices, no whispers, just the faint hiss of an empty room. Over the next few days, the murmurs became a regular occurrence. They always started around midnight, soft and rhythmic, growing louder the longer she stayed awake. Chloe began to dread the approach of nighttime. No matter how much she tried to ignore them, the voices continued, like a sinister lullaby. One evening, when the whispers began, she tried to confront them. "Who's there?" she called into the darkness. The murmurs stopped. For a moment, the silence was almost worse. Then a single voice emerged from the quiet, clear and deliberate. Chloe. Her name hung in the air, spoken with a strange lilting tone that sent chills down her spine. She bolted from her bed, turned on every light in her room, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. From then on, the whispers began following her. At school, she thought she heard her name murmured behind her in the hallway, though no one was there. In the car, the radio would suddenly crackle, and faint voices would rise from the static, repeating her name. Even at the grocery store, she caught the faintest trace of someone whispering from the next aisle. By the end of the week, Chloe was a wreck. She couldn't eat, couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. The whispers were everywhere, always just out of reach, always whispering her name. She tried blasting music, wearing headphones, even plugging her ears, but it didn't stop the sensation that someone, something, was right behind her, breathing her name over and over. She finally confided in Ella and Lucas. "It's like I'm being followed," she said, her voice shaky. "I hear them all the time now, and I swear I heard my name, clear as day." Ella frowned. "Maybe it's part of what we brought back from the woods." Lucas shifted uncomfortably. "If it's following you, maybe it's tied to you now. Maybe you need to confront it. Tell it to leave you alone." Chloe nodded, though the idea terrified her. That night, she turned off all the lights and sat in her room, waiting. The whispers came as they always did, soft at first, then growing louder. Her pulse raced as she took a deep breath and spoke into the darkness. "Who are you? What do you want?" For the first time, the whispers answered her clearly. "You." The voices erupted into mocking laughter, echoing through the vents, the walls, the very air around her. Chloe covered her ears and screamed, but the laughter only grew louder until it became the only sound she could hear. Lucas woke to silence. At first, he thought it was just the usual calm of an early morning, but something felt off. He sat up in bed, stretched, and waited for the familiar hum of the coffee maker downstairs, the muffled chatter of the morning news, or the faint creak of the bathroom pipes as his dad got ready for work. Nothing came. Rubbing his eyes, Lucas headed down the hall, the floorboards creaking under his feet. He called out, "Mom? Dad?" His voice felt too loud, too alone in the stillness. The house was empty. The car wasn't in the driveway. The kitchen was spotless,
as though no one had even been there. Lucas checked his phone. No new messages, no missed calls. He sent a quick text to his mom and waited, but the reply never came. Frowning, he stepped outside. The street was empty. No cars, no joggers, no kids biking to school. The neighborhood, usually alive with noise, was eerily still. The only sound was the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Maybe it's just really early, Lucas mumbled to himself. Though the sun was well above the horizon, he decided to head into town and see what was going on. As he walked, his unease deepened. He passed house after house, every window dark, every lawn empty. He crossed the main road and found the local diner shuttered, the parking lot vacant. The traffic lights blinked yellow over empty intersections. Even the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on him. By the time Lucas reached the town square, panic had started to set in. Where was everyone? The usual crowds of people heading to work, grabbing coffee, or shopping were gone. The grocery store was dark, its automatic doors refusing to open. The bank's windows reflected nothing but the still, empty streets. He tried knocking on doors, shouting into alleys, anything to find another person. The only reply was his own voice echoing back to him. His phone showed full bars, but every call he made went straight to voicemail. No one answered his texts. "Okay, this is a dream," he said aloud, trying to convince himself. This is some weird, vivid dream. But it didn't feel like a dream. The pavement under his feet was solid, the chill in the air biting. He felt the ache in his legs from walking so far. It was real. When he turned the corner onto Birch Avenue, he saw them. Figures stood in the windows of the houses lining the street. At first, Lucas felt a wave of relief. Finally, someone else. But as he walked closer, his relief turned to dread. The figures didn't move. They stood perfectly still, barely visible behind curtains and blinds. He called out to them, waving his arms. "Hello? Are you okay? Where is everyone?" No response. Lucas approached the nearest house and cupped his hands to the glass. The figure inside was faint, shadowy, but unmistakably human-shaped. It didn't react to his presence. He knocked on the window. "Hey, can you hear me?" The figure's head moved slightly, just enough to send a jolt of fear through him. It turned toward him slowly, and Lucas stumbled back. Though the room inside was dark, he could see a faint grin stretching across the figure's face. Not a warm, welcoming grin. A cold, unsettling one. Lucas stepped away, his chest tightening. He looked down the street. In every window, the figures now seemed to be facing him, their vague, shadowy forms grinning silently. He turned and ran. Back in the town square, he stopped to catch his breath. The wind had picked up, sending leaves skittering across the pavement. The sun seemed dimmer now, as if it were retreating behind a curtain of gray clouds. He needed to get out of town. Maybe if he made it to the highway, he'd find someone, anyone. Lucas sprinted back toward the main road, but the path seemed longer than it should have been. The streets blurred together, and no matter which way he turned, he found himself back at the square. "Where is everyone?" he shouted into the empty streets. His voice echoed,
the only sound in the oppressive silence. And then, faintly, a whisper replied, "They're all here, with us." Lucas spun around, but the square was empty. No one stood behind him. No shadows in the windows, no faces in the reflections. His heart raced. He couldn't stay here. He had to keep moving. Lucas picked a direction at random and started running again, his footsteps the only sound in the quiet, empty town. Ella's room had always been a sanctuary. Whenever things got too overwhelming, when the whispers in the woods became too much to think about, she'd retreat there. The pale blue walls, the neatly lined bookshelves, and the soft glow of her fairy lights always seemed to keep the darkness at bay. But not anymore. It began one morning with a faint stain above her desk. At first, she thought it was just water damage, some faint reddish-brown splotch that had bled through the paint. But when she ran her fingers over it, the surface was dry. The stain didn't smell of mold or damp wood. It smelled faintly metallic, like rusted iron. She ignored it, hoping it was a one-time thing. Over the next few days, though, the stain grew. Its edges spread outward, darkening, until it looked like a patch of dried blood. Ella tried scrubbing it off, but the color remained. Worse, she began to notice more stains appearing, faint at first, then spreading faster, as if the walls themselves were bleeding. They formed jagged lines, almost like letters, though no words she could recognize. By the end of the week, every wall in her room was streaked with those same dark lines. Ella borrowed a can of paint from her dad and spent an afternoon covering them up. But by morning, the stains were back, more vivid than before. This time, they weren't just random streaks. They had taken on a deliberate pattern. "Join us," they read. The letters were scrawled unevenly, some words larger and darker than others, like a frantic plea etched in blood. Ella's hands shook as she tried painting over the words again, layer after layer. Each coat seemed to work at first, but as the hours passed, the letters would reappear, bleeding through the fresh paint. Her room felt colder, even with the heater running. The faint metallic smell grew stronger, filling her nostrils until she couldn't stand it. Every time she looked away from the walls, it felt as though the letters shifted, crawling further out of the corners. She told her parents about it, but they brushed it off. "Old house," her dad said. Probably some rust leaching through the paint. But Ella knew better. This wasn't rust, and it wasn't water damage. It was something else. Something that wanted her to see those words, to know they were meant for her. One night, Ella sat on her bed, staring at the stains. She was exhausted from trying to fight them, and deep down, a part of her wondered if she should just give in. Maybe if she acknowledged the words, maybe if she spoke them aloud, this would stop. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and traced the letters on the wall. The moment her skin touched the stain, it felt icy cold. Her breath hitched as a faint sound filled the room, a whisper, low and indistinct, coming from the walls themselves. "Join us," it said again, clearer this time. Ella stumbled back, her heart pounding. She grabbed her phone and tried calling Chloe, but the call wouldn't go through. Every number she dialed came back as disconnected, even though she'd just texted Chloe earlier that day. Her room grew darker, the corners swallowed by shadow, and the words seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. By morning, the stains had spread beyond her room. They crept into the hallway, down the staircase, onto the living room walls. Her parents still insisted it was just a strange kind of damage, that they'd call a contractor. But Ella couldn't ignore the whispers anymore. She couldn't unsee the words. That night, as she sat in her bed surrounded by those crimson letters, Ella felt her resolve weaken. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't a plea now. It was a demand. "Join us." And for the first time, Ella wondered what would happen if she did. It was Lucas who suggested they meet in the woods again. His voice shook as he spoke, but there was a steely edge beneath it. "If we don't face this thing together, it'll never stop. We all know it." Ella hesitated. The memories of that Halloween night were still fresh in her mind, the whispers in the darkness, the way the forest seemed to shift and breathe. But she knew he was right. Whatever they had unleashed, it wasn't going away. Chloe and Mark agreed, their faces pale but resolute,
They would return to the place where it all began.
The forest was darker than they remembered. The trees towered over them like ancient sentinels, their branches weaving a thick canopy that blocked out even the moonlight. The air was heavy and cold, and the faint sound of rustling leaves seemed to come from everywhere at once. They each carried a flashlight, but the beam seemed feeble against the oppressive darkness. They reached the clearing just before midnight.
The four of them stood in a tight circle, the weight of the night pressing down on them. Lucas pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, a collection of old wards and chants he'd found in a dusty library book. "I don't know if this will work," he admitted, "but it's worth a try."
The others nodded, their faces set with grim determination. They lit the candles they'd brought,
their flames flickering weakly against the chill wind.
Lucas began to read from the paper, his voice trembling at first but growing steadier as he continued. The words were strange and guttural,
almost like a different language, and they carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the ground.
The moment he finished the first line, the whispers returned.
They were louder now, more distinct, no longer a distant murmur. The voices seemed to surround them, speaking over one another in a cacophony of anger, pleading, and mocking laughter. Ella felt her knees weaken as a cold hand brushed her shoulder. She spun around, but there was no one there.
"Don't stop," Chloe cried,
gripping Mark's arm as the shadows around them began to writhe.
Lucas kept reading,
his voice rising above the din. The wind picked up, scattering leaves and extinguishing one of the candles. The shadows coiled and lunged, their forms half seen in the shifting light. Ella's flashlight flickered, and in its stuttering beam, she saw faces faint, pale faces staring back at her from the trees.
Mark shouted something, but his words were drowned out by the howling wind.
The air was so cold now that Ella's breath formed visible puffs, and her skin prickled with icy dread.
She reached for Chloe's hand and gripped it tightly, feeling the tremor in her friend's fingers. The chanting grew more desperate. Lucas's voice was hoarse, but he didn't stop. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and a sound like cracking wood echoed through the clearing.
The shadows recoiled, then surged forward all at once, a wave of darkness rushing toward them.
Then, silence. It was sudden and absolute.
The wind stopped, the whispers ceased, and the darkness retreated, leaving only the four of them standing in the clearing, their candles extinguished. Lucas lowered the paper, his chest heaving with exertion. No one spoke. The forest was still, as if holding its breath.
For a moment, Ella thought they'd succeeded.
The shadows were gone, and the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. But as she looked at her friends' faces, she realized something was wrong. Chloe's expression was blank, her eyes unfocused. Mark's shoulders sagged, and his head tilted to the side in an unnatural angle.
"Guys," Ella's voice cracked. "What's wrong?" They didn't respond. Lucas turned toward her, his face pale and unfamiliar.
It was still him, but his eyes were empty, his features slack. He opened his mouth, but the voice that came out wasn't his own.
"It's too late."
The words echoed through the clearing, and the shadows returned. They rose from the ground like smoke, encircling the group. The whispering started again, louder, angrier, and this time, Ella understood the words. They spoke of punishment, of a debt unpaid, of lives that could not be reclaimed. The shadows closed in, and the candles flared back to life, their flames unnaturally tall and bright. Ella's heart pounded as she grabbed for Lucas, trying to shake him, trying to bring him back. But his body was stiff and cold, his eyes fixed on something far away.
The shadows closed in, and the candles flared back to life, their flames unnaturally tall and bright. Ella's heart pounded as she grabbed for Lucas, trying to shake him, trying to bring him back. But his body was stiff and cold, his eyes fixed on something far away. Ella's heart pounded as she grabbed for Lucas, trying to shake him, trying to bring him back. But his body was stiff and cold. His eyes, then in the blink of an eye, the shadows consumed the light. The flames flickered out, and Ella felt herself pulled downward, into the cold, into the dark. The last thing she heard was the sound of her own name, spoken softly, almost lovingly, before everything went silent.